This is a story about a young man who was the end of an era of bushrangers in New South Wales. He'd also be the youngest bushranger to be hanged for his crimes. This is a story about John Dunn. Now, history says he was born at Murrumburra in New South Wales, but he actually grew up on a property and it's nestled at the foothills of the Coppabella Ranges, but that's not very far from Murrumburra either. Now, exactly where he was born in the Coppabella Ranges, we're not sure, but we do know there's a creek runs through there called Bushranger Creek, so maybe that's a hint. Now, why did John Dunn become a bushranger? Well, there's a few possibilities. At a very young age, he and a mate robbed a Chinese miner. Now, maybe he continued on with that life of crime. We also know his grandfather, John Kelly, knew John Gilbert and Ben Hall, and maybe he introduced John Dunn to those men. But there's still no real reason to become a bushranger. But you have to cast your minds back to a life in Australia in the 1860s. And for John Dunn, he is the eldest of 9. And both his parents are ex-convicts, born into a life of poverty, a cycle he'll probably never escape from. But the bushrangers that he's met have. They ride around on the best of horses. They wear pretty good clothes, when most other people had to walk and could barely afford the clothes on their back. But most of all, these men were free. They could do as they liked. They commanded respect from everybody they came across. Even the police kept a safe distance because it wasn't worth your life trying to confront them. And maybe John Dunn saw an opportunity for a better life for himself. A life that did have respect, that he could do the things he wanted to do, but most of all, as a young man, there was excitement and adventure in the life of being a bushranger. And if excitement and adventure is what John Dunn is looking for, he's about to get plenty of it. We're at Black Springs in New South Wales. It's not very far from Jugiong. In November of 1864, and it's about a month after he's joined Ben Hall and his gang. Now they're here and they've got a bit of a blockade going on the Great Southern Road. They're stopping anybody who travels past. And by lunchtime they have a number of coaches, drays and 30 Chinese workers up on that hill. Ben Hall refers to it as his little town. Now at about lunchtime, a Constable McLaughlin comes past and challenges the bushrangers, and a shootout follows, and it's quite fierce. But Paul McLaughlin runs out of ammunition, and he has to surrender and join the rest of the spectators on the hill. Now things are pretty quiet for a couple of hours because Hall, Dunn and Gilbert are actually waiting for the coach that runs from Gundagai to Yass. And at about 2:45, they see it coming over that hill in a cloud of dust. And as it approaches, they see the coach driver wave his hat. And with that, 2 troopers come up from behind the coach. It's a Sergeant Parry and a Constable O'Neill. Now, the bushrangers are here and they see the coach and they say, "Oh, that coach has got traps." And they proceed up the hill. Now, the spectators think that they're retreating, but one of the bushrangers turns around and says, "Look, there's only 2 traps, let's mob them." And it's probably Gilbert. So they come back down the hill and they're riding with revolvers in hand and they're dancing around in the saddles, much to the admiration of our spectators. And they're firing upon the coach and the troopers. Now, Hall and Dunn, probably Hall's giving Dunn some tips on how to be a bushranger, go after O'Neill. Now, O'Neill's lucky he doesn't get killed or very seriously hurt because he's thrown from his horse and into a tree. And Hall will go up to him and fire 2 rounds, one through the bottom of his coat and one through the top, missing him both times. And you can't help wonder, either Hall's a very terrible shot or deliberately meant to miss O'Neill. But Gilbert and Parry are in a shootout about a 1/4 mile down the paddock, and people can hear what's going on. And at the end, Parry runs out of ammunition, and Gilbert calls for him to stand. And Parry, according to our spectators and witnesses, says that he'd rather die, and Gilbert shoots him. But you can't help wonder what's going through John Dunn's mind. He's young and impressionable. Gilbert's killed his first man. Dunn must want to feel now he wants to be part of the gang too. And the papers of the day also refer to him as a ploughboy bushranger. You see, Dunn's a small fellow. He used to be a jockey before he became a bushranger. So he looks kind of like a boy as well. But he's going to want to try to prove himself, and you can't help wonder whether he doesn't try to do that in coming months. After the murder of Sergeant Parry, the reward for Gilbert is raised, and the gang have to keep moving. They can't trust anybody. They keep making mistakes. They burned down Morrissey's store just after Christmas, but it's in January that John Dunn will make the mistake of his life. And this is Kimberley's Inn, now the Bushranger Hotel. And Hall and Gilbert are on the inside ransacking the place, left the young apprentice, John Dunn, on the outside to keep watch. Now word gets out to Nelson, the constable in town, what's going on. And he'll put on his uniform, take a carbine rifle, fix a bayonet, and tell his wife, in his last words, he'll do his best, and he heads down here. Dunn sees him coming along the road and hides behind a fence post. When he gets within range, he leaps out and tells Nelson to stand to, but then discharges one barrel straight at Nelson, hitting him in the chest. The second barrel he discharges, hitting him in the head and killing him. This is all witnessed by Nelson's 18-year-old son. But what Dunn has done now is he's no longer just a bushranger, he's a murderer, and he's on a collision course with his destiny. After the murder of Samuel Nelson, the gang have to keep moving. There's a sizable reward for all of them, including John Dunn. Now they're travelling north, holding up stations and coaches as they go. When they get up near Forbes, they decide to separate, and that's where Ben Hall will be ambushed by the police and killed. Now, we're not sure why they headed back to Binda. Was it a serious error of judgment, or was there something left behind? But they head back to his grandfather's place, and it will prove to be a very serious mistake. Now, Constable Hales of the Binda Police knows that Dunn's grandfather, John Kelly, doesn't live very far from here either. And he takes a chance and gathers Constables Bright, King and Hall, and they're going to go to the Kelly property and just keep an eye on things to see if those bushrangers turn up. The police from Binda will come out on foot after dark. They know coming out on horseback will be too noisy. Now, Hales and King come in overland in front of us. Hall and Bright will come in by the creek behind me. And they surround the place, and they stay here during the night, making sure no one comes or goes. And they stay here until about 1 o'clock in the morning until the lights go out. They return to Binda. The next morning, before first light, they do it again. They come back out and they stay and watch. So the constables from Binda, as we know, arrive here just before sunrise. Now, Bright and Hall will take up positions behind the house. They've come through the creek. King and Hales are just this side of the stockyards. Young Thomas comes out to check the bullocks, and Hales beckons him over and says, "Is there anybody in the hut?" Thomas says, "Nope." He says, "Has anybody been in the hut overnight?" Thomas says, "No." And Hales warns him that if he tells him a lie, he's in deep trouble. But believing Thomas, Hales approaches the hut from the front, and 2 shots fire out. He rushes up to the front room, and he can see 2 men in the back room through the gaps in the boards. And he calls out to the constables that there's bushrangers in the hut. He also warns Kelly that if he doesn't surrender those bushrangers, he's going to burn that hut to the ground. But then he hears 2 shots fire out. King and Hall have started shooting at Dunn and Gilbert as they run from a back window to a tree in the back part of the paddock. Now, Hall and King are in a shootout with Dunn. Hales comes around the property, joins Bright, and they notice Gilbert with a revolving rifle, and he's taking aim at them. But fortunately for them, the rifle misfires. Bright and Hales will return fire on Gilbert and they hit him, and he falls. They then notice that Dunn takes off towards the creek at the back of the property, and Hales gives the order to the constables to pursue him. But King has been shot through the foot, so he's given the job to stand guard over Gilbert's body at the tree, and the other three will chase Dunn down the creek for about 1.5 miles. But they just can't catch up with him, he's too quick. But they don't realise they've wounded him as well, he's been shot in the foot as well. John Dunn is on the run, he's wounded, but he's recovering from that and he's heading north. He goes past Forbes, he even gets past Dubbo. But was it worth it? Did he get what he was looking for at his grandfather's place? But it looks like John Dunn has escaped. In November of 1865, 4 police from Walgett have set out looking for Captain Thunderbolt. Now we know from our research that when Thunderbolt returns to the Tamworth district, 2 of his gang members have actually stayed in the district. December 1865, it's the 24th, and 2 policemen from Coonamble and 1 policeman from Canonbar have gone out to Coonamble Station and looking for a guy by the name of Walton. Now Walton has been known to harbour and know the whereabouts of some of these ruffians and vagabonds. The policeman from Canonbar is McHale, and there's Hawthorne and Elliot from Coonamble Police Station. They arrive just before morning and they go to talk to this Mr. Walton, but they're greeted by a George Smith, and he's the very man they're looking for, and they have a warrant for his arrest. And when he sees them, he bolts through the bush, he takes off. Now Hawthorne and Elliot, they'll go straight after him, legging it through the bush. McHale goes around the other side of the hut, hoping to cut off Mr. Smith. But what he sees is another man taking off through the bush, and that man is John Dunn. And McHale recognises him, he calls out, "John Dunn!" Now you get this impression that the troopers of the day, the traps as they called them, were sort of clumsy guys, a bit awkward, laden down with boots and jackets, and a little bit maybe unfit. Well, wrong. These guys were anything but that. And McHale takes off after Dunn and very quickly runs him down, and he stops, pulls out his revolver and says to Dunn to stand. Now Dunn leans over his shoulder and takes aim at McHale, but he doesn't fire, he just keeps running. So McHale again takes off after Dunn, gets within a few yards of him, stops, says, "John Dunn, stand." Dunn turns around again, but doesn't fire, but tries to take aim. He's still running, legging it through the bush. So McHale goes after him, and it's the 3rd time they do it. On the 4th time, McHale gets very close to Dunn, pulls out his revolver and shoots Dunn in the lower part of the back. Now Dunn goes ploughing into the ground, and he's thrashing around like a wild animal, and McHale's very cautiously walking up towards him. It's there, Dunn throws himself on his back, gets in a half-seating position and fires 2 shots off with his revolver, one of them hitting McHale just above the knee, the bullet hitting the bone and running up into his groin. The ball runs up into his groin. McHale just boom, goes straight on the ground. There you got both these men bleeding, a few yards apart, unable to move. Now McHale yells out to his comrades, Hawthorne and Elliot, who are still chasing Smith, that he's been shot. So they break chase and they come back to the shooting site. Now McHale is still conscious, and he's telling Hawthorne and Elliot what Dunn's doing so they don't find themselves in the firing line. Eventually they're able to get into a position where they can force Dunn to surrender. But Dunn is not going to. He gets up on his feet, remember he's got a bullet in his back, and he starts running through the bush. And they run after him and they wrestle him to the ground, and as they do, he turns around and fires again and just misses Elliot, and the bullet passes through the brim of his hat. But they've got the outlaw John Dunn, and they put shackles on him and they fully take him back to Coonamble Police Station. Dr. William Ransby, he is the doctor in Dubbo, gets word that his attention is needed to go up to Coonamble Station. It's about 110 miles from Dubbo to administer medical help to a Constable McHale who's been shot and the outlaw John Dunn. Now it's a 110-mile travel, takes him 2 or 3 days, and he gets there and both these men are very, very ill. They've been shot for over a week. He administers opium and morphine, he dresses their wounds, gets them into what we call a stable condition, and then in a cart, in the middle of summer, takes them back to Dubbo. It takes a couple of days. When they get them back to Dubbo, they're both very, very sick men again. So they clear all the policemen out of the barracks and they put them in the police barracks, just the two of them beside each other in a bed, so they get a bit of ventilation, a bit of peace and quiet, and hopefully they'll recover. But they don't have a lot of hope for Dunn. Now, on the 12th of January, on that evening, Mr. Hogg, now he's in charge of the Dubbo police station, goes to William Ramsby, the doctor, and says, "Do you think we should shackle Dunn to the bed tonight?" And the doc says, "Well, let me go and have a look at him." Takes his pulse. Dunn has been violently ill, hasn't had anything to eat or drink for a couple of days. He's been a very sick boy. Check his pulse, very weak pulse. And the doc says to Hogg, "Check his pulse." He says, "It's 60 or something." He says, "He's a pretty sick lad. I don't think he's going anywhere." So Hogg reluctantly doesn't shackle Dunn to the bed. 4:30 the next morning, Hogg orders Ramsey to come and see him in his office. And Dr. Ramsey walks in and says, "What's the problem?" He says, "Dunn's bolted." Now the doc is not overly concerned. He goes, "Oh, really?" But then he realises Hogg's expression is not one that he's expecting. And he says, "You mean Dunn escaped?" And he goes, "Yes." He thought bolted men died. Dunn's done anything but. He's escaped. Now, in the middle of the night, Dunn climbs out of his bed, climbs out through a bedroom window onto the veranda, across the street, and out of town. Now, there's a big furore in Dubbo because the outlaw, the notorious outlaw, John Dunn, has escaped. And their reputations look pretty average. But Dunn has got just out of town and he's tried to accost a young timber cutter who's bringing wood back into Dubbo. But he's not very successful at trying to steal his horse. So he begs for some water and this young fella gives him some water. When he gets back into town, he tells the police where he found Dunn and they go back out the next day and they find him hiding in a log. Now Dunn, by the time we get back to Dubbo, he is completely delirious. He is a very, very sick man. But he gets shackled to the bed every night from that day forth. When he recovers well enough, they'll put him in a coach in the middle of summer and they take him down to Bathurst. And then from there, he'll be put on a train and sent to Darlinghurst Prison, where he'll be tried for the murder of Samuel Nelson. John Dunn is sent here to Darlinghurst Prison to stand trial for the murder of Constable Samuel Nelson. And on the 19th of January, it'll take the jury 10 minutes to find him guilty. The judge will ask him, what was the temptation that led him into such a life? What was his chances of success? And where were his gains? He has before him a list of 15 other bushrangers. And did he think that John Dunn had immunity over others? 2 of those bushrangers had already been hanged. 4 had been shot. 2, Gilbert and Hall, his accomplices, and 9 other bushrangers now lay rotting in jail. But Dunn doesn't claim to be innocent. And there's a striking contrast between John Dunn, the bushranger, and John Dunn, now the condemned man. Just before his trial, he writes a letter to his father seeking assistance and forgiveness. And just before he's hanged, he writes another letter asking for his father and his brother to visit, but pleading that his mother doesn't. And he does have a keepsake for her. He also writes a letter to the governor of the jail, and he thanks the governor and Mr. Reader, his warder, for looking after him and being kind. You can see John Dunn is quite taken back for the fact that these people are actually very sympathetic in light of all he's done. And Mr. Carroll, his warder, will be looking after him in his last 2 weeks, and he's very appreciative of his assistance and attendance as well. He gets a great deal of strength from the Sisters of Mercy who visit him. But it's Mrs. Pickard, his godmother, and the lady who was with him at his birth that gets permission from the Colonial Secretary to visit him every day in jail. But his greatest strength will come from Fathers Dwyer and McCarthy, and they will be with him until his final hours. On a clear blue sunny morning in Sydney on the 19th of March 1866, John Dunn will climb painfully from his wounds he's received and not recovered from into the gallows for his last moments, alongside Father Dwyer. When he's cut down, there's a hearse waiting outside. It's paid for by Mrs. Pickard, his godmother. And he'll be taken down to the Devonshire Street Cemetery, not far from here, followed by his uncle and his brother. He'll be laid in a marked grave and placed with a headstone paid for by Mrs. Pickard.